The soldier never saw it coming. One moment, he sat tightening his harness inside the military aircraft as it passed over the thick Amazon jungle. The next, the entire plane convulsed with a violent shudder that threw every man out of balance. Warning alarms screamed through the cabin. Smoke burst from the vents. The engine's roar warped into an agonizing metallic howl. Soldiers shouted over one another, some praying, others calling out commands that no one could hear through the chaos. The soldier's gaze darted to the small window beside him, where the sky spun wildly in a blur of clouds and fire. As the aircraft lost altitude brutally, he clawed his way toward the side door, his instincts screaming that the plane was dying. Metal tore apart around him like paper. A wall of heat surged up through the floor. And somewhere, buried beneath the deafening crash sequence, a terrifying realization struck him. He might not survive the next minute. When the plane finally collided with the forest, the world around him disintegrated into shards of noise and pain. The fuselage slammed through treetops, twisting, folding, and crushing like a giant metallic beast being ripped open. The soldier was thrown across the cabin, then hurled into the undergrowth as the aircraft broke apart. When consciousness returned, he lay motionless on the ground, surrounded by smoke and distant flames. His ears rang relentlessly. His vision pulsed with static. He attempted to stand, but his body immediately collapsed beneath him. Something was horribly wrong with his legs. A wave of pain surged through him, sharp enough to steal his breath. As he raised his head, he saw the truth. His legs were mangled, broken beyond recognition, covered in blood and bruised flesh. The crash had crippled him, and in that bleak moment, staring at the wreckage that nearly killed him, he realized he could no longer feel anything below his knees. The jungle greeted him with indifference. It rustled and hissed around him, alive with its own untamed rhythm. Birds screeched in the canopy. Insects buzzed near his wounds. The distant call of an unseen animal echoed through the heavy air. Every sound felt like a threat. The fire crawling across the aircraft debris pressed him to act. He tore strips of fabric from his ruined uniform, wrapping what remained of his legs in crude bandages. Sweat poured down his face as he fought through shock and agony. Standing was impossible, so he began to crawl, dragging his battered body through the mud, roots, and shattered leaves. Behind him, flames consumed the wreckage in a rising inferno. The smoke towered above the treetops, a signal that would draw eyes, human or otherwise. He had to get away. And with every strained pull of his arms, he left behind the last remnants of the life he once knew. Somewhere deeper in the forest, new sounds emerged. Slow, rhythmic, unsettling. The soldier froze. These weren't animal calls. They were human voices, chanting in low, gravelly tones. He pressed his body into the damp earth and listened. Movement followed the sound, shapes drifting through the dense brush. Figures painted in streaks of red and white, spears glinting in the dim light. Tribesmen. Real. Silent. Focused. They spread out around the crash site, evaluating the wreckage with predatory curiosity. The soldier watched them from a distance, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. They were not rescuers. Their faces bore ritual markings, their bodies adorned with bones and animal skins. Their movements were deliberate, practiced, almost ceremonial. The realization washed over him like ice. He was injured, alone, helpless, and had fallen into territory ruled by hunters. From that moment forward, survival took on a new meaning. The soldier wasn't just escaping the wreck, he was escaping the people now drawn to it. Every shift of leaves, every hushed sound in the distance made his pulse quicken. His arms trembled as he dragged himself deeper into the jungle, each movement driven by raw instinct rather than strength. Hope became a fragile thing, flickering weakly in the back of his mind. But fear sharpened his senses and fueled the desperate will to continue. He didn't know how far he could crawl, nor how long his body could endure the torture. He only knew he had to disappear into the forest before the tribesmen discovered the wounded man struggling for life among the trees. And as darkness closed in, he understood the cruel rules of this new world. Stay hidden, stay silent, stay alive. Before the chaos, before the terror that would test the limits of his endurance, there was only the dull hum of the aircraft's engines and the quiet hope that the trip ahead would bring clarity to a life that had been drifting for far too long. As the story begins, the narrator invites every viewer to stay close, to listen deeply, and to walk through every moment as though they were there beside him. If you're watching this, he urges gently, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and comment your city and country below. Your support helps these stories reach more people who need them. In that suspended moment above the clouds, he had no reason to believe the world beneath him held horrors older than memory and more violent than nature. He simply sat there staring at the seatback, unaware that fate was about to tear open the sky and drop him into a wilderness ruled by shadows, whispers, and hunger. The plane creaked. A tremor passed through the floor, too subtle for the other passengers to notice. But he did. Something told him that the air itself was changing, becoming heavier, almost electric. Seconds later, alarms shrieked. The lights snapped off. Gravity vanished. And as the aircraft began its violent descent, the man who once carried ordinary worries, deadlines, bills, unresolved conversations, was thrust into a nightmare where survival required more than strength. It demanded silence, cleverness, and the courage to confront the kind of evil that didn't live in stories, but in the forgotten corners of the earth. He had no choice but to fall with the plane and rise alone. When he opened his eyes on the forest floor, smoke drifted through the treetops like wounded spirits fleeing the wreckage behind him. The ground was cold, damp, and seemed to pulse with an unsettling awareness, as if the forest itself had been waiting for him. Every bone in his body ached. Every breath tasted like iron and burning plastic. But he was alive, alone, disoriented, and surrounded by a silence so unnatural it threatened to crush him. There were no shouts from survivors, no crackling fire from the shattered fuselage, no groans of metal cooling in the rain-soaked air. Only an oppressive quietness that pressed against his skull. He knew immediately that something was wrong. Forests, even the densest and most ancient, were never this silent. Still forcing his lungs to steady themselves, he stumbled to his feet and took in the landscape. The wreckage was torn open like a giant carcass, and pieces of luggage, bright colors against the muted green, were scattered like offerings. Yet the strangest detail wasn't the crash site. It was the ground itself. No footprints, no disturbed foliage, no signs of creatures approaching to investigate the sudden intrusion. Nature had recoiled as though in fear. He didn't know yet what lived here, what hunted here, or what had learned the patterns of human movement centuries before maps were ever drawn. But a feeling gripped him. Cold, heavy, unavoidable. He wasn't alone. Something was watching him already. And whatever it was, it wanted him to remain silent. In the hours that followed the crash, he moved through the trees with painstaking caution, each step calculated, each breath controlled. His training, limited as it was, had taught him small things: how to read wind direction, how to avoid leaving obvious tracks, how to remain unseen when necessary. But nothing had prepared him for the sensations permeating this wilderness. It was as if he had stepped into a chapter of history untouched by modern time. The trees were massive, their roots twisted like the limbs of ancient creatures sleeping just beneath the soil. Vines hung like ropes, thick enough to support a man's weight, yet many had been cut, cleanly, deliberately. And woven into the trees were crude markings carved with bone-sharp precision. Symbols, warnings perhaps, or boundaries. He followed none of them. Instead, he kept close to the shadows, moving parallel to the patterns rather than crossing them outright, unsure of whether the carvings were meant to keep something out or keep something in. His mind warred with itself. Shock urged him to break down, to cry out for help, to sprint blindly until exhaustion swallowed him. Instinct begged him to disappear into the undergrowth. Reason reminded him that someone, maybe several, would eventually come searching for survivors. But beneath all those thoughts was a deeper, more primitive fear humming in his bones. A fear whispering that rescue would never come fast enough. That something had already seen the plane fall from the sky, and that somewhere in the darkness, footsteps were being placed with equal caution, tracking him. As night approached, he crafted a temporary shelter beneath a massive fallen trunk, using branches and wet foliage to obscure his silhouette. The forest changed personality as the sun dipped, becoming a living entity with breath, heartbeat, and hunger. The sounds returned, but not in the way he expected. Rustling, distant cracking, soft rhythmic footsteps that paused whenever he held his breath. These weren't animals. No creature moved with such deliberate slowness. The air thickened with the scent of smoke, but it wasn't from the wreckage. It carried notes of burnt wood, charred bone, and something far more unsettling. Cooked meat. Human meat, though he dared not accept the thought fully. A faint glow flickered between the trees, too red to be natural. He pressed himself deeper into his hiding place, his pulse pounding so violently he feared it might give him away. Then he heard them, voices that didn't resemble language so much as guttural calls, clicks, and hisses. Primitive, ritualistic. Their footsteps circled nearby. Shadows danced against trunks. He dared not lift his head, dared not make a sound, dared not breathe too deeply. When a pair of bare feet passed only inches from his hiding spot, he forced his muscles to freeze. A moment stretched into eternity, then another, and another. Only when the voices faded into the distance did he allow himself to collapse inward, shaking, understanding at last the truth. He had crash-landed not in a remote forest, but in territory claimed by cannibal hunters who moved like ghosts and navigated the darkness as their home. If they found him, there would be no mercy. By the second morning, the forest had revealed fragments of its sinister nature, but he still could not grasp the full depth of the danger stalking him. His throat burned with thirst. His ribs throbbed from the fall, and every inch of skin felt scraped, bruised, or bleeding. Yet survival demanded movement. He scavenged what little he could from the wreckage. Half a torn jacket, a metal buckle that could serve as a crude blade, and a small water bottle cracked near the top but still usable. The deeper he traveled, the more he sensed the presence of invisible borders. The forest seemed to study him, guiding him away from certain areas while urging him toward others. But each path was laced with signs of previous victims, shredded fabric caught in branches, bones with gnaw marks, makeshift traps, some broken, some disturbingly fresh. He began to understand that he was not the first to fall here, and he might not be the last. That knowledge fueled him with desperate determination. If there was any chance of escape, he would have to outthink opponents who had spent their lives perfecting the art of pursuit. He had to become quieter than their shadows, faster than their rituals, smarter than their hunting patterns. Most of all, he had to stay alive long enough to find an opening, any opening to flee this cursed place. And so his story continued not as a man who hoped to be rescued, but as one who realized he might have to rescue himself from the jaws of an ancient nightmare. The first true morning after the crash arrived with a wash of pale light, struggling to pierce the dense ceiling of branches overhead. It was not a comforting light. Instead, it felt weak, fragile, as though even the sun feared shining too boldly upon this cursed land. He rose from his hiding place slowly, each muscle stiff and aching from the uncomfortable position in which he had slept. The forest around him breathed in slow, eerie rhythms, windless yet somehow alive. Every rustle felt intentional. Every whisper of leaves suggested something lurking just beyond the range of vision. He brushed dirt from his clothes and listened closely. Nothing. Absolute silence again. It was wrong, but it was the closest thing to safety he had. And so, with a trembling exhale, he prepared himself to move deeper into the unknown. He retraced his steps toward the wreckage, knowing he had left valuable supplies behind in his frantic escape the night before. His movements were cautious but determined. He understood that returning was a terrible risk, but also a necessary one. The trees towered around him like crooked guardians, their limbs twisting as though trying to warn him away. When he reached the debris field, the smell of burnt plastic and scorched metal struck him like a physical blow. Bits of clothing fluttered on branches like forlorn flags, marking the resting places of memories. He knelt near a broken section of fuselage and sifted through the scattered belongings. A torn backpack, a first aid kit missing half its contents, a dented flashlight that flickered when shaken. Each item felt like a lifeline, but it was the silence, again that oppressive silence, that kept his heart racing. Something was wrong, something was missing. Bodies. There were no bodies. Not a single victim from the crash remained. Not a single sign that anyone had died or lived through the impact. No blood stained the soil. No scraps of clothing bore the marks of scavengers or panicked survivors. Everything had been wiped clean, as if the forest had swallowed the evidence whole. His breath hitched. He scanned the ground for footprints, drag marks, anything that could explain the impossible. Then he found it, a trail of disturbed leaves, barely noticeable but unmistakable to someone desperate enough to see patterns in chaos. The path led away from the wreckage and disappeared into a darker patch of woods. He crouched low, touching the leaves gently. Something heavy had passed through here, several somethings judging by the depth. His stomach tightened. The cannibals had reached the wreck before he had. A paranoia-laced urgency pushed him to finish gathering what he needed. He found a long, bent piece of metal that could serve as a spear with some modification. He bundled cloth into strips for bandages or disguises. He filled the cracked water bottle halfway, using a puddle that at least appeared cleaner than others he had encountered. But the whole time he worked, he felt the sensation of eyes on him. Not metaphorical eyes, real ones. Watching, calculating, hunting. He scanned the tree line repeatedly, but nothing moved. And yet he knew, with every instinct screaming, that the cannibals were close. Too close. He didn't dare call out. Instead, he backed away from the wreckage with slow precision, ensuring he left no clear trail behind him. The deeper forest greeted him with a different kind of darkness, one thick enough to muffle sound and swallow hope. The temperature dropped as he ventured deeper, causing his breath to mist even though it was still daytime. He paused near a cluster of boulders shaped like crude altars, each scarred with carvings similar to the symbols he had seen the day before. These were more detailed. Spirals, jagged lines, depictions of figures surrounding what looked like a fallen human form. His pulse throbbed in his ears. Rituals, territory, warnings. He stepped around the stones, careful not to disturb the arrangement. The last thing he needed was to trigger whatever the symbols were meant to represent. The forest seemed to tighten around him, pushing him onward along a narrow, shadowed corridor between massive tree trunks. Hours passed, though time felt warped in this suffocating landscape. Hunger began gnawing at him, thirst sharpened his agony. He found a cluster of berries on a low bush, violet and swollen with juice. His hand hovered above them, trembling with desperation. But he hesitated. They could be poisonous. Or worse, they could be placed intentionally to bait prey. The cannibals, after all, were hunters of both flesh and fear. Remembering the old advice, when in doubt, go without, he forced himself to turn away. Every survival instinct screamed that he needed calories, but survival was not about comfort. It was about choosing the least terrible option. So he pushed on, forcing his weakened body to obey commands it no longer wished to hear. Eventually, he reached a river, wide, slow-moving and brown with sediment. It wasn't clean, but it wasn't stagnant either. Kneeling at the bank, he filtered water through his shirt into the bottle and drank cautiously. The relief was instant, though faint. He washed his face, scrubbing dirt from cuts and wiping blood from his hands. It felt almost human, almost normal. But that illusion shattered when he spotted footprints on the opposite shore. Bare footprints, several pairs, large ones, small ones, all pressed deeply into the mud as though a group had stood there observing the river, perhaps even watching him at that very moment. A cold shiver crawled up his spine. He ducked behind a fallen log, peeking over it carefully. No movement, no sound. But the prints were fresh, too fresh. A sudden crack echoed through the trees. His blood chilled instantly. He dropped into a crouched position, the makeshift spear raised defensively. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, drowning out everything else. The crack came again. Closer this time. He pressed himself against the log, barely daring to breathe. Shapes moved in the distance. Shadows danced between trunks. He strained his eyes, trying to focus. Through the slivers of light filtering through the canopy, he saw them. 3 figures, half naked, smeared in ash and streaks of dried blood, moving in slow, deliberate steps. Their heads jerked from side to side, sniffing the air like predators tracking wounded prey. One carried a bone staff capped with feathers, another dragged something behind him, a rope of sorts. A snare. His stomach dropped. They were hunting. He stayed frozen as the cannibals wandered along the riverbank, searching for any disturbance. One crouched and ran his fingers through the mud, inspecting the texture as though reading a story in the earth. The man clenched his jaw tight to avoid gasping. If they found any hint of his presence, he would be dead within minutes. One of the hunters lifted his head abruptly and sniffed the air again. His eyes narrowed. He turned sharply toward the place where the protagonist hid behind the fallen log. For one horrifying second, their eyes nearly met. But the hunter suddenly twisted away, distracted by a distant sound deeper in the forest. A cry. Human or otherwise, he couldn't tell. The 3 figures hissed to each other and sprinted toward the noise with unnatural speed. Only when they vanished did he dare move again. His entire body trembled violently. He had come seconds from discovery. When the forest finally stilled again, he rose from his hiding place and backed away from the river until the water could no longer be heard. Sweat stung his eyes. His legs felt weak, but the narrow escape had taught him 2 important things. He could not stay in one place for long, and the cannibals operated in groups, moving swiftly and silently through their territory. To survive, he needed height, visibility, and distance. And so he began climbing a steep ridge that promised a vantage point. Each step burned. Each breath tasted like metal, but he forced himself higher because he knew the truth now. The forest was not merely watching him, it was choosing whether he deserved to escape. And if he failed to resist exhaustion, fear, or despair, the cannibals would claim him as they had claimed everyone before him. From the top of the ridge, the soldier expected at least a moment of relief, some sense of distance between himself and the cannibals who stalked the undergrowth below. But the higher vantage point only revealed how vast and unforgiving the jungle truly was. Waves of green stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by jagged cliffs and winding rivers like serpents carving through the earth. The forest canopy shifted in slow, unnatural motions, as though the trees themselves breathed. Looking down at the path he had climbed, he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. Broken branches. Leaves disturbed in a way he had not caused. Someone, or something, had moved through here recently. The realization struck him like a blade. There were multiple hunting routes. The cannibals didn't just move through the forest, they patrolled it. He crawled across the ridge, keeping his body low as he scanned for signs of safe descent. The slope on the opposite side was steep but manageable. Jagged roots jutted from the earth, forming a natural ladder. He exhaled slowly and began lowering himself inch by inch, relying entirely on the strength of his arms. Every movement sent pain radiating through his torso, but he forced himself onward. Halfway down, he paused. A deep, rhythmic thumping echoed from somewhere behind him. Drums, primitive, ritualistic, but unmistakably drums. They reverberated through the forest floor like the heartbeat of some terrible creature. The sound grew louder, steadier, structured. He swallowed hard. It wasn't a celebration. It was a signal. The descent suddenly felt far more urgent. He pushed himself faster, ignoring the sting of bark and stone against his palms. At the base of the ridge, he slipped and crashed into a bed of leaves, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. He gasped, eyes darting wildly for movement. Nothing. For now. The drums continued, but now they were accompanied by distant chants, long, guttural, and filled with a rhythm that made his skin crawl. He didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Summoning, gathering, preparing. The tribe was mobilizing. Whether for a ceremony or a hunt, he couldn't know. But both possibilities promised danger. He forced himself to crawl forward again, driven by the knowledge that staying still meant death. The forest thickened around him, branches clasping like skeletal hands, and vines curling around his wrists as he pulled himself through narrow paths. Every few meters, he stopped to listen. Birds fluttered overhead, their wings beating frantically as if fleeing from something. The soldier's breath grew quieter. He could feel the humidity thickening, hear the buzzing of insects that circled his wounds. His skin burned with irritation, and dizziness crept into the edges of his vision. But he kept moving. He had no choice. At one point he nearly stumbled into a pit camouflaged by palm leaves, its base filled with sharpened stakes carved from bamboo. The sight made his blood run cold. A trap, freshly built, and not for animals. The discovery forced him to rethink the path ahead. The tribe's presence wasn't just heavy, it was intentional. They were creating corridors within the forest, channeling prey exactly where they wanted it to go. He dragged himself sideways, avoiding the pit and searching for any sign of untouched terrain. Finally, he spotted a narrow opening between two gnarled trees, their trunks bent inward as though watching him pass. The space beyond them opened into a clearing bathed in weak sunlight. For a fleeting second it felt welcoming, almost peaceful. But he knew better. Nature, especially here, didn't offer peace without cost. He pushed himself into the clearing cautiously, his hands trembling with fatigue. In the center of the clearing stood something that froze him entirely. A wooden structure, tall and skeletal, adorned with bones and strips of dried skin. It looked like a crude totem. Human skulls hung from its top, arranged in a circle, all facing outward as if guarding the heart of the forest. He studied the remains carefully. Some were old and bleached by the sun. Others were fresh, still stained with reddish-brown tissue. His stomach churned violently. This was a boundary marker, a warning, maybe even a trophy. The soldier held his breath and lowered himself until his body was pressed against the earth. He knew the rule in every dangerous environment: never disturb cultural markers. They represented far more than territory. They represented identity, ritual, and vengeance. As he lay hidden, he heard the first twig snap, then another, then several. The sound came from the path he had taken to reach the clearing. He didn't dare move. He didn't dare even blink. Through the grass, he saw the first pair of feet step into view. Bare, calloused, smeared with dark paint. Then a second pair, then a third. 3 hunters entered the clearing, scanning the area with sharp, predatory focus. They sniffed the air, crouching low as if reading invisible trails left behind by movement. One approached the totem and brushed his hand across the skulls, murmuring something under his breath. The others spread out, checking the tree line. One of them walked so close to where the soldier lay that he could see the veins pulsing in the man's ankle. He closed his eyes and prayed the hunter wouldn't look down. His heart hammered so violently that he feared they might hear it over the pulsing drums echoing faintly from somewhere beyond the trees. Sweat poured down his face. Every muscle burned from remaining perfectly still. The hunter paused, sniffed, tilted his head. For one horrifying moment, the world stood frozen. But then, shouts erupted in the distance, sharp, urgent. The hunters jerked their heads up, responding instantly. They sprinted toward the noise with terrifying coordination, disappearing into the brush. Only when their footsteps faded entirely did the soldier dare move even an inch. He rolled onto his back and stared at the sky through the canopy, lungs dragging in deep, shaking breaths. He had escaped again, barely. But the close encounter had taught him something terrifying. The tribe didn't just hunt near the crash site. They hunted everywhere. Their senses were sharper than his, their speed unmatched, their familiarity with the terrain absolute. The soldier realized that if he stayed near their territory markers, he wouldn't last another hour. He needed to head toward the river again. The water, though dangerous, meant direction and possible escape routes. Crawling on land made him slow, but anything was better than staying within the hunter's paths. He pushed himself toward the far edge of the clearing, wincing with each movement. His arms trembled violently from exhaustion, but he continued dragging himself through roots and foliage until the forest swallowed him again. Ahead, he could hear faint trickles of water, distant but steady. A river. He set his jaw and crawled toward it with everything he had left. The forest behind him growled with drums and shouts. The hunters were moving again, searching again, calling to one another with signals carved into centuries of ritual. As he crawled into the shadows between massive tree trunks, one truth carved itself into his mind with brutal clarity. He wasn't merely running from the tribe. He was navigating through a deadly game they had perfected long before he arrived. And every step forward would be a step through their world. The river appeared before him like a twisting scar carved through the heart of the jungle, its surface dark, sluggish, and deceptively calm. To someone else, the sight might have offered relief. To him, it was both salvation and trap. Water meant mobility, cooling, hydration. But water also carried sound, scent, and footprints. The tribe could track anything that touched the riverbank. He paused on a patch of soft mud, watching ripples drift lazily downstream, carrying pieces of leaves and bark like tiny rafts. His breathing steadied as he realized the river flowed east. East meant lower elevation, which meant an eventual exit from the forest. The idea sparked a faint glimmer of hope, fragile but real. He adjusted his position, dipped his hands into the water and splashed his face. The cold bite of it revived him enough to think clearly, but clarity came with fear. He was too exposed here. He crawled along the bank, keeping low, tracing the edge of the river while staying hidden beneath overhanging roots and ferns. The forest behind him thickened with a chorus of unsettling noises, distant drums, guttural calls, and rhythmic clacks that sounded like bone tapping against wood. It was impossible to tell if those sounds came from rituals or hunts. Maybe both. The riverbank, however, provided fewer places for the tribe to hide. That alone made the soldier choose it as his path forward. As he moved, he noticed animal tracks, paw prints, small rodent trails, a single large paw with claws that carved into the mud. A predator had passed recently. That meant danger, but also opportunity. Predators created noise that disrupted hunts. Predators distracted the cannibals. Perhaps for the first time the forest might work against his enemies. The sun barely penetrated the canopy here, leaving the river valley cast in a dim half-light that flickered with the movement of branches above. He reached a narrow point where the river constricted between rocky walls. Water rushed through it in a fast, churning channel, producing a faint roar. The sound was comforting. It masked the noises he made while crawling, but he understood the danger instantly. If he slipped, he would be swept downstream like debris. His arms, already trembling from exhaustion, could betray him at any moment. He examined the rocks, slick, algae-covered, jagged in some places. The current surged against them violently. He weighed his options. Crossing was impossible, but navigating alongside them seemed doable if he moved slowly and deliberately. He pressed his palms to the cool stone and began pulling himself forward inch by inch. Halfway across the ridge of rocks, he heard a sound that froze every muscle in his body. Voices, not chants, not calls. Whispered conversation. 2 voices, maybe 3, drifting from the forest above him. His pulse kicked into overdrive. He flattened himself against the rock, sliding into a shallow crevice where water splashed lightly over his lower body. Through the ferns, he saw shadows moving. The hunters approached the riverbank with slow, attentive steps. Their faces were painted in ash and clay, forming grotesque expressions across their features. They carried long spears adorned with feathers and small bones. The soldier ducked lower, letting the spray from the water disguise his scent. One hunter crouched near the river's edge and dipped his hand into the water, sniffing it before tasting it. The soldier's stomach twisted. They were tracking him by every means available: scent, sound, intuition. The hunters examined the mud closely. One pointed to a faint mark, the trail left by his dragging body. A low growl rumbled from the hunter's throat. They spoke softly to one another, gesturing downstream. Then suddenly, one lifted his head sharply and sniffed the air. His gaze turned toward the rocks. The soldier's muscles tightened to the point of spasming. The hunter stepped forward slowly, spear lowered, posture rigid. Inch by inch he walked toward the very place where the soldier hid. He could see the man's ankles through the ferns now, the paint on his skin. The dirt caked beneath his toenails. The spear tip hovered dangerously close. And then, just as the soldier felt certain the hunter sensed him, a distant scream echoed from deep within the forest, the kind of scream that could only come from another human. The hunters spun around instantly. Without hesitation, they sprinted toward the sound, their bodies cutting through foliage with disturbing agility. He remained frozen for nearly a full minute after the hunters vanished. Only when his shaking subsided did he pull himself from the crevice. The river roared beside him, indifferent to the life-and-death encounter. He knew he had to move before the hunters returned. He crawled again, following the water downstream until the channel widened into calmer terrain. The air grew thick, humid, and heavy with the scent of wet soil. Birds shrieked overhead in chaotic bursts, as if warning him. As he moved, he began to hear something new, a rhythmic sloshing. It wasn't the river. It was ahead of him. Something large was moving through the water. He stopped, muscles tense. Then he saw it, the silhouette of a crocodile gliding silently near the opposite bank. The reptile's eyes were cold, unblinking, and fixed somewhere downstream. It didn't seem to notice him, but its presence unsettled him deeply. Nature was not his ally, and even the animals here felt like extensions of the forest's cruelty. Still, he kept crawling. Eventually he reached a bend where tree roots dipped into the water like thick ropes. He spotted a hollow beneath them, dark, damp, but hidden. He slipped inside, using it as temporary shelter. From here he watched the river and listened for movement. Minutes passed, then more. His breathing slowed. His heartbeat steadied. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to rest. But as fatigue washed over him, so did memories. Images of the crash, the screams, the chaos inside the aircraft. His legs, gone in an instant. Pain flared like a phantom limb, gripping him with torment. Tears pricked his eyes, but he forced them back. He couldn't afford the luxury of breaking. He pulled himself from the hollow after his brief rest, driven by the need to cover more distance before nightfall. The light filtering through the trees was dimming, casting the forest floor in a haunting bluish tone. Twilight came fast here. Too fast. And night was when the hunters truly owned the jungle. He crawled along the bank until he noticed something unusual. A series of vines tied around trees in a repeated pattern. At first glance they looked natural, but the knots were too uniform, too intentional. They formed a boundary, a warning or guide for the tribe. He traced one with his hand. The vine was smooth from repeated handling, its fibers worn. These were path markers, and he had stumbled onto the edge of one of their travel routes. Panic surged. He moved away from the vines, heading toward a cluster of fallen logs for cover. As he maneuvered around the logs, a strange sound reached him, a high-pitched whistle, faint but deliberate. He froze. A reply came seconds later from somewhere deeper in the forest. Another, then another. Whistles, communication, a coordinated search pattern. His jaw tightened. The tribe wasn't just hunting randomly, they were tightening a perimeter, trying to trap him between the forest and the river. He dragged himself into the shadows between two massive roots, pulling leaves over his body to camouflage himself. Moments later, he saw figures glide silently across the forest floor. 5 of them this time, larger group. They carried torches, though the flames were dimmed with some sort of damp resin to reduce visible glow. The hunters fanned out in a sweep. Their steps were slow, synchronized, predatory. The soldier pressed himself deeper into the mud, praying the darkness would swallow him. The hunters passed dangerously close, one so near that the soldier could hear him breathing. But they continued forward, unaware of the man buried beneath roots and debris. Only when the last of them disappeared into the far trees did the soldier exhale the breath he had been holding. He emerged slowly from his hiding spot, coated in mud and trembling from the strain. But he had survived again, barely. With the last scraps of strength in his arms, he crawled back to the river and looked downstream. The water curved away into darker parts of the jungle, but it was still the only direction that offered escape. Grinding his teeth against the pain, he pushed onward, knowing that the night would soon fall. And with it, the forest would become a place no human should ever remain exposed. Night settled over the forest like a thick curtain, swallowing colors, muting sounds, and turning every shadow into a possible threat. The soldier lay against the twisted roots of a massive tree, his breath trembling from exhaustion. His arms burned from hours of dragging himself across uneven ground, and every muscle felt as if it were unraveling. The jungle's humidity clung to his skin, mixing with sweat and dirt until he could barely tell where one ended and the other began. For the first time since the crash, he wondered if sunrise would even matter. If morning light could truly change anything, or if this forest would simply continue consuming him inch by inch. But the forest never slept. Crackling leaves echoed around him, too light to be a large animal, but too heavy to be wind. The soldier stiffened, pushing himself deeper into the roots, breath held tight. A faint glow appeared in the distance. Torchlight. 1, 2, 3 flames bobbing through the darkness. The cannibals were searching again, sweeping the area in slow arcs as if they could smell him. He lowered his gaze, refusing to meet the light directly, hoping his stillness would make him blend with the earth. The torches drew closer, flickers highlighting their painted bodies and the sharp edges of their primitive weapons. The search party paused. One of them sniffed the air like a predator tracing scent. The soldier's pulse thundered in his ears. His bandages were soaked, sweat, blood, and mud. Maybe they could smell that. Maybe they could smell fear. The hunter stepped closer, raising his torch higher, the orange flame illuminating the roots only a few feet from where the soldier hid. Every instinct told him to run, but running was no longer an option. Even crawling would make noise. The soldier forced himself to remain still, praying silently that the earth would disguise him for just a little longer. A sudden noise saved him, a distant animal cry, sharp and frantic. The hunters turned their heads instantly, torches swinging. They communicated with low grunts, then began moving toward the sound. Within seconds, the light faded into a glow, then into distant sparks, and then into nothing. The soldier collapsed against the roots, the silence ringing in his skull. Relief washed over him, but so did a new realization. They were not wandering aimlessly. They were tracking him. The crash site had not been far. They must have seen the smoke, or found his blood trail, or followed broken vegetation. They were narrowing the distance. He couldn't stay in one place, not anymore. The soldier braced his palms against the soft ground. Pain shot through his shoulders as he dragged himself forward, inch after inch. The soil felt like sandpaper against his bandages, tearing fresh wounds beneath the cloth. He tried to bite back groans, but even his breath came out ragged and loud. The night made every sound sharper, and he feared each exhale would give him away. Yet he moved, because the only alternative was becoming prey. His body screamed to stop, but his mind repeated a single truth. If I stop, I die. Hours blurred together as he crawled deeper into the jungle, following the distant rush of water. The sound was faint but steady, a promise of cleansing, of direction, maybe even escape. But the terrain changed. Roots rose like walls, and the forest floor grew uneven. At one point he slipped into a shallow pit filled with wet leaves, his forearms sinking into the muck. Panic struck fast as his body got stuck, the suction pulling at him. He fought back, clawing through the mud, dragging himself out with violent, desperate jerks. His breath came out in sobs he didn't have the strength to muffle. When he finally freed himself, he rested against a fallen log, trembling uncontrollably. Is this worth it? He thought. Is survival supposed to feel like dying slowly? But then another thought followed, one that grounded him. He pictured the pilot who didn't survive, the crew who didn't make it out. He heard their voices, their laughter, the everyday conversations that felt like a lifetime ago. They didn't get the chance he was given. And though his legs were gone, life remained, breath remained, purpose remained. That truth lifted him enough to continue. As he crawled onward, the forest thinned just slightly. Moonlight trickled through gaps in the canopy, silvering the leaves and painting the path ahead. Then, unexpectedly, the ground rose into a natural ridge. The soldier dragged himself up the incline, using vines as leverage, each pull sending lightning bolts through his arms. When he reached the top, he paused, and the sight stole his breath. Down below, a massive wooden structure stood between the trees, a watchtower, primitive but tall, close enough to the crash site that it had likely been built for exactly one purpose: to monitor movement through the forest, including him. Fear iced his spine. If they had a watchtower here, they could see nearly everything. No matter how careful he had likely been visible at some point during daylight. Maybe that was how they followed him. Maybe they already knew the direction he was heading. The realization pressed heavily on him. But there was also something else. Just beyond the tower, down the hill, he saw water glimmering. A river, wide, slow, and quiet beneath the moon. It wasn't escape yet, but it was direction. It was hope. The soldier forced himself to keep low as he slid down the far side of the ridge, away from the tower's line of sight. The river was close. He could hear it now, a soft, soothing rush carried on the cool night air. Each pull brought him closer, and with every inch gained, he felt some part of his resolve strengthen. He didn't know how long the cannibals would take to realize they had lost his trail, or how soon they would find it again. But he knew one thing with complete certainty. He had something they didn't, a reason to keep going. And the river was calling him toward whatever came next. Dawn approached slowly, brushing pale streaks of gold across the treetops as the jungle awakened with cautious chirps and distant growls. The soldier reached the riverbank just as the first light touched the water, the soft glow reflecting off the surface like fractured glass. He stopped at the edge, his arms trembling from the night's endless crawl. His shoulders ached so fiercely he could hardly lift them, and the bandages around his legs were soaked, heavy and foul-smelling. But he had made it. The river was real. Cool mist rose from its surface, carrying the scent of fresh water, cleaner, purer air than anything he had breathed in days. He closed his eyes, taking one long inhale, letting it fill him with a fragile sense of possibility. But peace never lasted in this forest. Leaves rustled behind him, not in the gentle, rhythmic way of wind, but in a pattern that screamed intent. The soldier froze. Then came voices, low, guttural, tense. The cannibals had found his trail again. Maybe they tracked the disturbed vegetation he'd left behind. Maybe the watchtower had spotted movement, or maybe they were simply relentless hunters who knew their territory far better than he ever could. His pulse spiked. The river offered hope, but it also left him exposed, with no cover and no easy way forward. He scanned the bank desperately, searching for anything that could help him. A stretch of heavy reeds caught his attention. Tall, thick stalks clustered along a shallow bend, their shadows deep enough to hide him if he could reach them. It was his only option. The soldier lowered his body to the ground, pressing his chest into the damp mud and dragging himself forward. Each push felt like lifting a mountain. His elbows sank into the soft earth, slipping, forcing him to dig with his fingertips. He could hear the hunters more clearly now, their steps breaking twigs, their weapons clinking softly. They were moving quickly, calling to one another, sweeping each area with ruthless precision. The soldier gritted his teeth and pushed harder. As he reached the reed bed, he slipped inside just as the first of the hunters emerged from the tree line. The soldier held his breath, sinking lower until his body was half submerged in the muddy shallows. From between the stalks, he had a fragmented view of the tree line. The cannibals spread out, scanning the open riverbank. One of them knelt, touching the ground where the soldier's dragging marks clearly ended. The hunter lifted his head, sniffing the air. The soldier's lungs screamed for oxygen, but he did not move. Not even his eyelids dared to blink. The hunter stood and barked an order. 2 of them moved upriver. 2 moved down. 1 walked straight toward the reeds. The man's silhouette grew larger with every step, the glow of morning revealing his painted face and the cruel, bone-carved knife in his hand. The soldier felt the water around him ripple with his trembling. The hunter stopped only a meter from the reeds, staring at the surface as if trying to decipher shapes beneath it. The soldier's mind spiraled. He sees me. He knows I'm here. This is it. But a sudden splash erupted nearby, a fish leaping out of the river and slapping the water. The hunter snapped his head toward the noise. After a tense moment, he stepped away, joining the others as they regrouped further inland. The soldier finally exhaled, the air leaving him in a shaky rush. He waited until their footsteps faded before emerging from the reeds. He knew he couldn't stay near the riverbank. They would return. They always returned. But the current was moving smoothly eastward, carrying leaves and branches downstream. If he couldn't travel the forest floor safely, perhaps he could let the river carry him. The thought terrified him, being swept into unknown waters without legs, without control, but the alternative was being hunted until they caught him. The soldier dragged himself to a fallen branch lodged at the water's edge, thick enough to serve as makeshift flotation. He wrapped his arms around it, pulling himself halfway over. The cold water surged around him, stealing his breath. Pain stabbed through his legs as the bandages soaked fully, but he held on tight. With one final push, he let the river take him. The current tugged at his body, spinning him slightly before guiding him downstream. At first, the panic was overwhelming. Every swirl felt like a threat, every deeper patch like a mouth ready to swallow him. But slowly, rhythm found him. The branch held, his grip remained solid. The sun continued rising, warming his face as trees drifted by, their branches arching over him like a cathedral of twisted limbs. For the first time since the crash, the forest felt less like a prison and more like a passageway. Still, danger never strayed far. Twice he heard distant shouting from the shore, though the voices never grew close enough to see him. Once, he spotted movement through the trees, painted figures running parallel to the riverbank, searching desperately. They had realized he had vanished. Their frustration echoed across the jungle. But the river shielded him, carrying him quietly through bends and narrow channels. Hours passed, though exhaustion blurred the time. His arms grew numb. His fingers cramped around the branch. More than once he nearly slipped, and each time he forced his eyes open, whispering to himself that he couldn't die now, not after everything he had survived. When the river widened, the current slowed, revealing a stretch of calmer water. The soldier drifted along its surface until his branch caught on a cluster of rocks. He managed to pull himself partially onto them, resting his upper body against warm stone. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sun soak his skin. That's when he heard it. A faint rhythmic thumping. Not drums, not footsteps. Something wooden hitting water. The soldier lifted his head, squinting through the glare. Downstream, emerging from fog-like mist, came a small wooden boat. 2 fishermen stood inside, casting nets with slow, methodical movements. They hadn't seen him yet. The soldier's voice cracked before sound even formed. He tried again, pushing against the rock to lift himself higher. "Hey!" His cry came out broken and thin. The fisherman froze, looking toward the sound. The soldier waved an arm desperately, his hand trembling violently. "Help! Please!" The boat turned, and as it approached, their shocked expressions grew clearer. One of them shouted back, rushing to lower the net. They reached him, pulling him gently but swiftly into the boat. As they laid him down, the soldier felt the final surge of relief crash over him like a wave. He had escaped the cannibal forest. He had survived the impossible. And as the boat drifted away from the trees that had nearly claimed his life, the soldier realized that where strength had failed, sheer will had carried him through. His story wasn't ending here, not with fear, but with deliverance. As the fishermen guided the small wooden boat toward their distant village, the soldier lay on a bed of worn nets, staring up at the open sky with a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. For days, he had known only the suffocating canopy of the cannibal forest, its choking humidity, its predators, its hunters. Now the sky stretched endlessly above him, soft and brilliant, untouched by the fear that had gripped him since the crash. Every gentle sway of the boat, every splash against its wooden frame, felt like a lullaby easing him away from horror and back toward life. The fisherman checked his pulse, offered water, wrapped his legs with clean cloth, and spoke to him with voices that trembled in shock at what he had endured. The soldier couldn't form full sentences in reply, but his eyes held the truth. He was alive. Against all odds, he had made it out. When they reached the riverside settlement, the villagers rushed to help, lifting the soldier carefully and carrying him into a shelter where he could rest. Word of the lone survivor spread quickly. Some people whispered prayers, others stared in disbelief as they examined the torn uniform of the soldier who had crawled through the jungle without legs, surviving not just nature, but the brutality of those who hunted him. The soldier drifted in and out of awareness, but even in those blurry, half-conscious moments, he felt something shift inside him. He realized that survival wasn't only about escaping danger. It was about rediscovering the part of himself that refused to surrender, the part that clung to a floating branch when his body tried to let go, the part that hid beneath reeds while death stood inches away, the part that still believed, even faintly, that life beyond the forest was possible. As days passed and he regained strength, the soldier understood that the forest had taken much from him. His legs, his safety, his sense of certainty. But in its own merciless way, it had also revealed the depth of his resilience. He would carry the scars forever, both visible and hidden, yet they no longer symbolized suffering. They symbolized triumph. He had walked into that jungle as a soldier defined by duty and left it as a man redefined by survival. When he finally watched the river at sunset, its water glowing gold and peaceful, he knew his journey was far from over. But now, for the first time since the crash, he faced the future with something stronger than fear. He faced it with hope.